Good evening, everyone, and welcome to the Union Chapel, a super iconic event, a super iconic venue, as it is, but hopefully also an iconic event. It's wonderful to see so many incredible faces giving up their Friday evening to join us for this conversation about the future of global politics. My name is Dalia Gebrial. I'm a director at Planet B Productions who put on this event. I'm also a lecturer in social justice and geography at King's College London and a contributor at Novara Media. So I'm just going to explain a little bit how this event is going to go. Think about it as a kind of live podcast extravaganza where you're going to get to sit back and watch some incredible thinkers and activists take stock of this strange political and economic juncture that we find ourselves in. And of course, most importantly, to think about what kinds of futures we can make from this moment. For our opening act, we're going to focus on setting the economic context with a live recording of the podcast MACRODOSE. That will last for about 45 minutes. After that, there will be a short interval where you can grace the bar with your presence just down there. You can also check out the merch and the books on the stalls at the back. And then we will be back with Dan Denver of The Dig and Eleanor Penny of the Verso podcast, Jeremy Corbyn MP, and Professor Laleh Khalili. And they will be the second act of the show and will be wrapped up by about 10:15. So I just want to remind you that these shows are only possible with the kind support of people like you. Shows like MACRODOSE and The Dig rely really heavily on contributions from listeners so that we can stay independent. So if you like what you hear tonight, please consider supporting The Dig and MACRODOSE at their respective Patreons on patreon.com. And you can also support us by, again, buying various pieces of merch from the table at the back, including the t-shirt that I am modeling right now. And there's also a stall back there from Houseman's Bookshop. They'll be selling books that will be talked about, I'm sure, today. So, that is my sales pitch over. That's not what you guys all came here to listen to. So, let's get on with the show. For those of you who don't know, MACRODOSE is a podcast from Planet B Productions that brings you your weekly fix of everything economics in short, sharp, 15-minute doses. But tonight we're going to be treated to a little bit longer, 45 minutes. And it's normally hosted by economist James Meadway, but today I'm going to be taking over as host and putting him in the hot seat as a panelist. So please put your hands together and welcome to the stage the MACRODOSE panel. So, today, James and I will be joined by Thea Riofrancos. Thea is an associate professor of political science at Providence College, a strategic co-director of the Climate and Community Project, and a fellow at the Transnational Institute. Her book, Resource Radicals, explores the contentious politics of oil and mining in Latin America, and she's also the co-author of A Planet to Win, Why We Need a Green New Deal, and her next book is Extraction, The Frontiers of Green Capitalism. And we're also joined by Asad Rehman. Asad is Executive Director of War and Want, having previously worked as the Head of International Climate at Friends of the Earth. Asad is probably one of the most prolific organizers in Britain with over 30 years of experience working in justice issues across the board, from police brutality to climate change to poverty. And you might recognize him from one of the many times he's been on stage at the UN holding world leaders' feet to the fire. So, I'm going to begin with a really simple question, just to kind of warm the panel up. James, I'd like to start with you. Why is our economy so broken and seemingly unable to get better?
Well, Thanks for that, and thank you everyone for coming this evening. I mean, look, there's a very simple answer, and you make it a very quick event if I just said it's capitalism. And we can all go to the bar somewhat earlier. I'm going to come back to that, because I was talking to a friend, Stella, earlier, and we both realised that the last time we were here was perhaps the last time I felt as optimistic as I do now about politics in England. And that was on the 7th of June 2017, which was the eve of poll rally for the 8th of June 2017 general election. It was a huge gathering of people here who'd been campaigning for Labour then, led by Jeremy Corbyn, who was here then as well, of course. And the atmosphere in the room was extraordinary, because there was a realisation that we're on the verge of potentially doing something really spectacular, that having been written off since Jeremy was elected Labour leader in 2015, I mean, utterly dismissed by the sort of political mainstream, we were on the verge, clearly on the verge of a breakthrough. That everybody had been out knocking on doors, who had been to the campaign rallies up and down the country, could see what was happening. And we came this close, and we shouldn't forget this, to winning and being able to form a government. And frankly, if it hadn't been for things like the deliberate sabotage by senior people in the Labour Party at the time, we could have won that election. And we may as well be clear about that. Read the Ford report if you want on this. But that sense of optimism, that sense of possibility, was exactly what I'm getting at the minute, coming back here, on the back of the election we just had. And yes, of course, we've not got Jeremy Corbyn as Prime Minister, we've got Keir Starmer, in case you hadn't somehow noticed at this point. Son of a toolmaker. And but look underneath those headline results. Look at Labour winning this thumping great majority thanks to our stupid electoral system, with fewer votes than Jeremy not only didn't got in 2017, actually got in 2019, which is quite impressive if you think about it, if you remember how that election was talked about. But if you look underneath this, the 4 Green MPs elected, the 5 independent MPs, including Jeremy, and now these 7 MPs booted out, or at least suspended, but let's face it, well, they have a choice. I can say it to all of them. They have a choice. They can sit very quietly and nod along and accept everything Keir Starmer does for the next 6 months, and maybe they'll be allowed back in, or they can not do that and think about doing something different, and I know which I'd pick in their situation. That we have this group now of MPs, there we go, at least one person. We have this group now in Parliament of left-wing MPs who are not in the Labour Party, at a time when we're facing a series, and this is why things are not getting better, a series of crises that are directly about the relationship between capitalism and the environmental crisis. That the fact that food costs so much, that you go to the shops and see how much a bottle of olive oil costs now. The fact that potatoes have gone through the roof in terms of prices. Everyday stuff costs so much because we're in a climate crisis and there's profiteering off the back of this climate crisis. And what are Labour going to do about that? Well, even the £300 they said they'd knock off your energy bill, that's been quietly forgotten about. So that's the situation we're in. And yes, that is desperate. And it's desperate because there's a Reform UK out there as well, snapping at the heels of Labour across great swathes of the north of England. But there's also the hope there that there's something different that can be done and that can be built. So that's why I'm sitting here feeling optimistic. Yes, things are getting worse. And I hate to break it to you, but if you listen to the podcast, you'll be well used to this by now. Things are going to continue to get worse. But what you're starting to see here, and in France, and in Mexico, and across the world, is the possibility of doing something different, of changing how that system operates, of addressing the crisis, the environmental crisis we're in, and getting rid of a brutal system of exploitation that generates this mess for the rest of us.
Yeah, I mean, Thea, what's interesting in the US is you have this kind of high investment Biomics approach, which seems to be the thing that we are always asking for. But how is that actually, what effects has that actually had in terms of this chronic problem of economic crisis? Has that sheltered the US population more than, say, here in Europe?
Yeah, there's this really fascinating phenomenon in the US, which I'm not sure how many people would be familiar with here, where we're constantly told that it's like the best economy that we've ever had. And on certain indicators, it does look good, right? Like we came out of the pandemic with growth, inflation in various sectors has come under control. Employment is looking good. So this month in particular, wages in some low-wage sectors have risen, but the average American doesn't feel that way, right? And so there's a kind of weird thing where the pundits keep saying, why aren't people more grateful for this wonderful economy that we've given them, right? And I think, some of that can speak to the disconnect, and maybe, yes, ordinary people may not track all of these indicators, but some of it is that a lot of the core aspects of what labor exploitation looks like, of what the cost of living looks like, have really not changed and actually are getting worse. I mean, I think one of probably the most glaring gaps of so-called Bidenomics, which is supposed to be this turn away from neoliberalism, where, as you said, we get a lot of state investment, a lot of public spending, a more pro-labor administration, is that ordinary people can't pay the rent, right? I mean, the housing crisis is extremely severe in the US, and it's basically been untouched by Bidenomics, right? So it's a kind of strange thing where, yes, if you work a low-wage service sector job, you might be making a bit more, but you can't afford the astronomical rent, right? So at the end of the day, you're still kind of caught in this class trap, and that is not at all being addressed, and in a way that's maddening, not being talked about by pundits and by economists.
Yeah, and in terms of that kind of story of the economy, Asad, your work spans the globe, basically, and I think it's really interesting that we are thinking about this idea of a broken economy here in the global north, in Europe and America, in the US. But from your perspective, I mean, there's also, for the vast majority of the global population, there has never been a golden age of capitalism. So how is this kind of economic crisis being experienced from your understanding about, the global majority?
Yeah, I think the economy is not broken, right? It's rigged, and it's been rigged in a particular way for centuries. And of course, the hierarchy of between the global north and the global south has been that its punishment has been on the global south, right? You can go all the way back to doctrine of discovery, slavery, colonialism, imperialism, neoliberalism, right to this moment. And the same model has been used, right? Exploitation of people, extraction of resources to benefit the global north. Now, recently, of course, we're seeing that same policies are being visited now on working people and working class in the global north, but for a long time it's been primarily on the global south. And and I think it's just really interesting when people talk about the economy, right? And especially when progressive people talk about the economy, because we talk about the economy within our nation state without talking actually that we live in a global economy, right? And this global economy and the British economy is being built on the exploitation of other people. I mean, I'm originally from the Indian subcontinent. People generally know that figure that flies around all the time, that the UK looted 45 trillion from India alone. But actually, when you unpick that and you see what happens, right, from India's share of the global GDP, 24%, when the British left, it had fallen to something like about 4.2%. Life expectancy went down. In 40 years, it's estimated 100 million Indians were killed during that British rule. I mean, the equivalent of what happened to India was as if Britain had dropped 1,000-ton bombs on India, the level of deindustrialization. And, and that's, of course, been the same story in so many other parts of the world. And it's not just an historical story, because, apart from that brief period of post-colonial movements, of taking power, wanting a new economic model, talking about nation-state building, talking about, bringing those resources under public control, etc. And then, of course, the majority of them were overthrown, assassinated, dictators put in place, largely, and, of course, with the hand of either the US or the UK within them. But the story for most people in the global south is crisis. It's a permanent crisis we're facing. It's a permanent crisis. Structural adjustment programs which privatized, liberalized the economy, destroyed people's health systems, pushed people into dependency on commodities, on cash crops. It created the economy that we have benefited in relatively in the global north for a long time. Of course, the redistribution of that wealth was in the social compact. You could say it was determined at one point, and now that extraction of wealth within countries is going to the elites and to the rich as much as it is between the north and south. But when you think about some of the figures, it is staggering because I listen to Rachel Reeves and she talks about there is a gap in public expenditure, so we're going to have some form of austerity. And then you think about what's taken out of the global south. Between 1960 and 2018, just of the unequal exchange, estimated that's 152 trillion from the global south to the global north. Between 1990 and 2015, the labour and resources that have been extracted from the global south, 242 trillion. If you think about the carbon space that the global north has overconsumed, it's another 192 trillion. I mean, these figures are just immense, but they are immense because, those inequalities and injustices that we see around the world are not natural phenomenon. They're, as Warren Womtley would say, poverty is political, right? They're the result of political decisions and of economic decisions. So from the rest of the world, often our movements, when they look at what's going on in the global north, they're like, so now you know what we have went through and have been going through for decades. Now we have a common fight. We have a common fight around the same issue, which is where I think there is real hope, because you can build real unities and rebuild a class across international borders and remind ourselves that as progressive movements, we're the internationalists.
Yeah, I think it's one of those stories that we're told about development, right? Is that the global majority, the global south, they're going to, if they stay on the capitalist industrialization track, then one day they might get to live like Europeans, when actually the story is the exact inverse. It's in fact that working classes in Europe and North America, their conditions are beginning to resemble more the conditions that were once reserved for the global majority. It's kind of like my mum always says, my mum's Egyptian, as is my dad, and she says, people in this country don't know until now what it means to wake up one morning and the price of chicken has quadrupled. It's like now that experience is beginning to be more generalized. So, Thea, I wanted to pick up on something you said there about the inability of traditional economic storytelling to really give a picture of what is actually happening in people's everyday lives. Could you tell us a little bit more about why traditional economics is kind of unable to really meet this moment that we're in and the economic crises that we are facing in this historical moment?
I kind of want to punt that question to James about traditional economics writ large. I mean, maybe I'll segue a little to something I was thinking of saying that was similar to some of Asad's points. Like, one of the things that impressed me the most about doing work in Latin America, so I'm going to just take us afield of where we are right now for a moment, is that ordinary people there, working class people, people without college education, are extremely knowledgeable about how the global economy works, right? And they know how it works in a visceral sense, but also in a conceptual sense, right? Like, I've had conversations with cab drivers that have taught me what neoliberalism means, and they use that language, right? So I think, this isn't it's sort of an indirect answer to your question, but something that's impressed me about Latin America is the fact that there is a tremendous amount of cumulative historical knowledge among ordinary people about why the economy doesn't work for them, right? And they can describe in 100 years long time frames, but also on the time scales of decades or presidential administrations, like how, as Asad said, the global financial system is rigged against the global south, how the rules of trade are rigged, how what we call neoliberalism is built atop a whole edifice of colonialism and neocolonialism, right? How there's an international division of labor, not just a national division of labor. And so there's this kind of fluency on the part of ordinary people from lived experience and also just from a lot of political militancy and work and learning that I think produces a situation. Of course, in Latin America, traditional mainstream economists tell the same lies, right? But where ordinary people don't quite believe those lies and they have alternative stories to tell and alternative histories to tap into. And I think it's sort of no accident that while in the global south writ large or in Latin America specifically, we've seen some of the worst ravages of the global economy, we've also seen, I think, some of the most inspiring movements and policy ideas about how to dismantle neoliberalism and actually implement post-neoliberalism, right? What we get called as post-neoliberalism in the US, like, does nothing to touch this larger global economy that Asad talked about, right? But when Latin Americans talk about a transition away from neoliberalism or a transition away from extractivism, they mean something that is global in scope as well as having local and national ramifications, right? So you have proposals that date from actually the 1920s around resource nationalism, right? You have more recent proposals around the rights of nature, or what it might look like for indigenous peoples to have self-determination around the land that they live on, right? You have ideas for how to regionally integrate Latin America so you can have a green economy that crosses national borders, right? So for me, those are inspiring ideas that mobilize people, but also kind of paint a picture of what an alternative world system might look like, not just what alternative domestic kind of scale policies might look like. Wow.
Yeah, I mean, riffing off of that, James, you know, you a trained economist, you know, you've worked in the academy, you've worked in policy. So from someone who's been in the kind of eye of that, why do you think that traditional economics can't really grapple with or conceptualize or is failing to meet the moment that we're in?
There's two parts. Like being described as a trained economist, like being a trained seal or something, you know, going bounce an abacus in my nose. The two parts of that. One is that, look, the sort of mainstream of economics was never really intended to provide a sort of an immediate and obvious explanation of what was happening in the world. That it was not intended to explain why there was inequality, it was intended to explain away why there was inequality. And it will be a series of justifications, really, since the development of what is now the fundamental theories of mainstream economics in the 1890s. A series of efforts to explain away the facts of exploitation, the facts of unequal exchange, as actually just a market operating. And if we let the market operate freely, as we all know, everybody will be made better off and everything will be good in the end. And that's the basic sort of model for economic growth that the whole world is meant to be signed up to in one form or another. And that's the sort of deep logic of, like, what is mainstream economics about. It is both an attempt to sort of explain the world in order that the people who are running the world can do a job of organizing things, but it's also an attempt to justify why that world is like this and why these people are in charge. And that's the big part of it. The bit that's also kicking in now, I think, is in some ways even more fundamental, because it affects people who are not even sort of mainstream economists, which is that we are now experiencing the most incredible blowback from about 200 years of industrial capitalism, of relentlessly churning out more and more greenhouse gases, of resource extraction on a huge scale, of the various sort of biophysical limits that are being crossed, you know, traipse across in merry abandon over the last sort of 15 years or so. And all of these things are producing a response. It's hard to be a climate change denier by this point, because fairly obviously something is happening. You notice they're all turning into delayers of various sorts. They're all becoming people who say, well, maybe what's the point doing this? If you read the Reform UK manifesto, they basically say something like, they've got a section in it, oh, well, climate change is kind of happening anyway, so probably not really worth us bothering with it. Let's go and do something else. And it's quite that kind of delay mentality. It's happening anyway, it's nothing to do with us. That's where they've all ended up. That's the blowback from those 200 or so years of that extraordinary amount of very, very intensive resource extraction, of which climate change is sort of the most pressing, most obvious today. That produces the impact that pretty much everything you do all the time is going to be somewhat affected by this, often in completely bizarre and unexpected ways. My favourite one of which remains the way in which jellyfish have taken to attacking nuclear power plants around the world on a fairly regular basis, because unlike most sea creatures, jellyfish quite like warm, acidic waters. Climate change makes the seawater warmer and more acidic. Jellyfish go crazy breeding in these great swarms. Nuclear power plants by the sea need to suck in seawater to cool down their reactors. They suck in millions of tons of jellyfish, get clogged up and have to close down. And then this happens on a pretty regular basis by this point. They have to put in special nets. There's the place up in Scotland, the last remaining sort of nuclear power plant functioning in Scotland, has a system of drones to try and scan for jellyfish swarms appearing at the sea. That's a direct result of climate change that is making it harder to produce electricity. Similar thing, by the way, France's river nuclear power plants. They have them on French rivers. They have to take water from the rivers to cool the reactors down. The river water is getting hotter, so they can't cool the reactors down as much. That means you can't produce as much electricity. That means the price of electricity in Europe is higher, as a result of climate change affecting nuclear power plants. This happens all the time. So conceptually, this means that everything you're doing, well, you think, if you take this kind of standard view of how does the economy operate, is something we do and here is nature. This is a lot more like here is nature and it's being done to us. And that's a really difficult thing to think through. And this is part of the reason why not just sort of economists and economic theory is having a great deal of difficulty, worsening difficulty, dealing with the kind of crisis we're in. You're also seeing major institutions are just failing to cope with this. You know, take the Bank of England, which happily now talks about the price of food going up because of climate change. What is the response to this? Oh, well, we'll put up interest rates. How is putting up interest rates going to stop wildfires and droughts in Spain and therefore cut the price of olive oil? It's not going to happen, right? The institutions don't work. So this creeps in everywhere. And that, I think, is both a theoretical problem, because it's an understanding of the world problem, and it's an institutional problem, because it means the institutions that we have that have these theoretical understandings just don't even have a concept of how to address this stuff. That's the real challenge, I think, that we're up against now.
Yeah, and I wonder if, you know, the way that you're describing this kind of, this illegibility of the moment that we're in within traditional economics thinking, you know, one of the goals of the MACRODOSE podcast is to situate, as you well know, James, the climate issue as an economic issue, to understand the climate crisis as a fundamentally economic crisis. So would you say that we are, in a sense, entering a new economic era with its own rules? And is that actually what the problem is?
Yes. Yeah, that's exactly it. I think, there's a sort of description which has attracted some controversy, but it's quite handy to talk about the period we're in as the Anthropocene, the period in the Earth's sort of geological history where, unlike all preceding history, what humanity has done is now changing the way in which the basic processes of the Earth function in lots of weird and unexpected ways. Earthquakes becoming more frequently climate change as a result of changes in how the distribution of water operates on the planet. You get more meltwater appearing, it changes the weight of water, it appears to be producing more earthquakes around the world. So there's lots and lots of extraordinarily complicated interactions that we basically spent the last 200 odd years kind of kicking and waiting to see what happens, and lo and behold, a load of things happen. So we're moving into a world where, instead of us being able to say with some authority that we have a kind of sovereignty over nature, we have a power over nature, and we have an understanding of how to use that power to get us all these nice things, we will generate economic growth. We're now living in a world where nature is imposing itself in a fairly hard way, in lots and lots of different ways of how we might try and use and reshape the world. So that's a resource depletion problem. You know, there's lots of talk about, Thea has written brilliantly about this, that we all want to switch into using electric vehicles to decarbonise rapidly. Well, fine. But to do this, you're going to need an awful lot of copper. And there are limited supplies of copper on the planet. They're only in certain places. You have to go and get the copper. And there's a real fight brewing over who gets that copper and how they're going to get it and use it in the electric vehicles and to build all the new electric wiring that we need when we're decarbonising and electrifying everything. So you start to run into these resource problems all the time. Same with lithium, which you need for batteries, that you need for your electric vehicles that you're going to build. You're starting to hit these things. But most fundamentally, I think, because climate change is so disruptive, that agriculture is disruptive, that the big data centers you're running your ridiculous large language models, your artificial intelligence so-called are hugely resource intensive. A typical sort of hyperscale data center uses the same amount of water as 40,000 people. That's a lot of water that you're going to have to suck out to somewhere in order to get the thing running. You're going to run into hard barriers all the time in this. We are collectively no longer simply able to say we're in charge and we can shape the world as we wish. And that means that if you have a system which is permanently driven to try and generate economic growth, finds it harder and harder to get economic growth, it becomes increasingly brutal as a result. So as capitalism wants to generate growth, because this is the source of profits and surplus value, but can't generate growth, it has to look for other sources. And that's where the real conflicts, I think, start to appear. Resource conflicts that is, you will have your wages cut because somebody else is trying to generate that growth for themselves, and direct, in some cases, I think, direct wars that we're already starting to see over critical resources.
Yeah, Thea, could you go a little bit more into that, the kind of the politics that extractive kind of capitalism are coming up against, and how, again, the traditional economics elites are kind of trying to confront that or deal with that from the places in which you work?
Yeah, it's fascinating. I mean, I work a lot with this concept, green capitalism, and I'm using the scare quotes intentionally, but I'm also using the words green capitalism intentionally, right? So there's, I think on the one hand, green capitalism is an oxymoron. It's a contradiction in terms, right? There's no situation in which it's possible that capitalism could fully internalize its ecological drain and use of resources, right? Or become fully sustainable or fully decarbonized or whatever that would look like, right? And so I think, on the one hand, there's a deep tension in the term green capitalism, and one of the biggest clues to that is the extractive and material foundations of all of the vaunted technologies to get us out of the climate crisis, right? Whether it's batteries or EVs or solar panels, whatever they are, they start with mining, right? And there's a whole long history that Asad has actually already talked about of unequal economic and ecological exchange between the sort of peripheries and frontiers of global capitalism, where those resources come from, and the centers of manufacturing and consumption and investment decision making, right? So that basic inequality, which is an inequality in an exploitative relationship with nature, but also an international inequality in terms of where the resources are and who benefits from them, is being reproduced quite rapidly under, quote, green capitalism, right? Because of the tremendous amount of mined resources that are necessary. So that's one thing, but I'm gonna kind of bring in a couple of, I think, interesting developments that I think are important for the left to grapple with, because as important as what I just said is, I also think it's obvious on a certain level, and there are some more head-scratching developments. One is that mining, while it will still happen primarily in the global south, or let me say more broadly, resource extraction, that pattern that Asad said of basically the flow goes south to north is unchanged right now, and I don't see it being changed. But there is an interesting development where global north countries, for a variety of reasons, including the conflictual security politics reasons that James was just pointing to, are saying, we also want to do this mining at home. So you have mines popping up in Germany, in Spain, in Portugal, in the US, in Canada, right? Places where for many, many decades have been primarily importers of those resources. Mining is going to happen within these jurisdictions, right? So what does it mean for the global north to also have these extractive industries? What types of new conflicts are opening up? What does an anti-mining movement in the global north look like compared to the global south? Are those movements being connected? The answer is yes, but it raises a lot of interesting questions, and also I would say political possibilities about, maybe a flip side to Asad's point about a global working class is a kind of global anti-extractive movement, or a global movement that's attuned, to the harms of extraction. One other thing or two other quick things I'd like to add in there about so-called green capitalism is that it's extremely dependent on the state, right? And this is something that James explores a lot in his podcast. Extremely dependent on state subsidies, tax credits, consumer rebates for EVs, all sorts of state support, which is not necessarily a bad thing. I'm a socialist. I'm okay with the state spending money. But the question is, who's benefiting from that money? And I think the deeper question is, if we have so much public intervention in the economy, why don't we own the economy? Right? Why doesn't the public actually own the economy? If we're subsidizing it, we should just own the wind rather than just subsidizing a company to build the wind farm. And I think one last thing that we should think about as progressives, as leftists in this new moment of capitalism is the geoeconomics, the geopolitics, right? And I'm speaking very much from a US perspective here, but there's no scenario under which we'd get as much climate spending, if we want to call, that's what the Biden administration is doing, or energy spending, without the sort of new Cold War with China. It's precisely because the US wants to compete with China that finally we're getting a modicum of climate and energy spending. There are climate advocates, even people I'm friendly with, who are super happy about that. They're like, great, we have an economic rivalry with China. That means the US is going to race ahead and build all this technology and competition. But I personally am quite concerned about a new Cold War with China, especially since so many other aspects of the climate crisis demand global cooperation, not geoeconomic rivalry.
Yeah, I mean, Asad, if we are in this moment where these kind of mainstream political and economic institutions are fundamentally ill-equipped to kind of meet the contradictions that are surfacing in the economy, what is an alternative way of organizing? What is an alternative kind of political and economic institution that we can be building that can meet this moment in the way that traditional institutions and organizations are unable to?
Well, I mean, it's interesting because when you're in the Global South, the Global South movements, this has been a conversation, and often many Global South movements say, well, we're doing the same thing we fought for 100 years, right? I mean, all it is, this is just anti-imperialism. We were talking about economic sovereignty. We were talking about prioritization of people's well-being. We had ideas like Ubuntu, living well, all of these ideas, Mother Earth. Before you in the Global North started talking about putting well-being at the center of your economies, this is exactly what we were doing, and you killed us and crushed us for talking about this. So it's great that you're talking about this. Oh, and by the way, now you understand this whole issue about the IMF and the World Bank and debt, because actually you're also being caught up in it. But we have that, and we have a rich history and language, and you're absolutely right. If you look at the protests in Kenya, for example, around the fact that Kenya pays half of all government revenue back in debt repayments, or you look at the social movements that arose in Sri Lanka when the multiple crises of debt, climate, inequality hit, you know, people's language and understanding of that crisis was really profound. You know, if you look at the placards in Nairobi, they talk about, you know, this is the same economic slavery you had us under during colonialism. It's the IMF. People know what the institutions are. And I think there's much for us to learn about how you talk about the economy, where you put people and planet at the center of it, rather than talking about the economy the way that actually we do in the Global North, which is about growth. Growth about what? What growth? Well, I mean, we all look at the TV and it says, you know, growth is up 2.2%. What does that mean to me? We don't talk about, have we as ordinary people have, you know, achieved a set of minimal, you know, being able to live with dignity. We're in a moment where 80% of the world isn't able to live at the minimum level, which is enough for, you know, for food, housing, health and education, etc. That's not where we are. But at the same time, we know, you know, that actually pendulum is going the other way. The fact that in this country we have, in the 6th biggest economy, we should be asking ourselves, why is it we've got millions of children growing up in poverty, why we've got 4.7 million people using food banks? How is it? Is that when the Chancellor or whoever these people are on television and they talk about the economy, we're not at the part of that conversation, and we have to make ourselves part of that conversation. So there is a way of doing that, and people talk about that, you know, and they look back to Bandung, the Bandung conference, which brought the anti-colonial movements together. They look at the sort of conferences around the new economy, and there are very much lots of initiatives and lots of thinking about what does it mean to decouple yourself from the global economy. What does it mean for more regional solidarity and cooperation? How do economies be able to better share limited resources and capacity? And this isn't partly just in academic circles. People realize, because it's coming to them in a hard truth, they looked and saw a global crisis when it came to the COVID pandemic, and they saw the global North turn its back on the global South. They let them, after destroying the health system, said, you're by yourselves, whilst they were pumping trillions into protecting our own economies. They said, you all can get more debt-creating loans. When we do create a vaccine with public money, we said, we'll sell it to you. We're not going to make it, we're not going to lift the intellectual property rights on it. And people realize that. I mean, everybody's got televisions. People can see the global North and the global South, and they saw that and said, we still continue to be the sacrifice zones. So there is a new way of talking about the economy, but I don't think it's one way. And actually that's also quite interesting, that when we talk about what the future is, actually I think we're talking about what multiple futures there will be, what multiple alternatives there will be. There won't be one global economy. It's just not possible. It's not realistic at all as well. Yes, we live in a global world, but our economies are not going to be connected in the same way that we think and that globalization has created so far.
So following on from that work of imagining different ways of thinking and organizing the economy, I want to end on a high note. Between the three of you, your work covers a lot of ground in terms of the climate economic space. You know, you work from different locations, you work in different sort of sectors, you work with different groups of people. So, James, I'm going to start with you. What is one movement, organization, writer, person that is currently inspiring you when it comes to some of the vision work that we have been talking about today?
All right. Well, I already said that I was feeling that peculiar thing of feeling optimistic about English politics. But if we take a sort of, as we really ought to, pick up on what Asad said, a sort of internationalist view of this, because we have to. And I thought your point was really important, actually, that, look, it's the crisis itself that brings people together, right? There is you can see it, by the way, the processes of what's happening in capitalism is you find that because there has been, over the last 20 years or so, if you want to talk about a golden age of capitalism, there's this sort of, I think it's Eric Hobsbawm, the economic historian, talks about in the West in the 50s, 60s, 70s. Lots of growth, great for Western countries, pretty terrible for everyone else. Actually, golden age of capitalism for much of the world was last sort of maybe 10, 20 years or so. Huge growth in China, some growth occurring in Brazil, India, a few other places around the world, not just necessarily in the core countries of capitalism. But that has meant that if you go and look at how much being paid per hour to work in a factory in Shenzhen on the southern coast of China, it's not that far off how much you might start to be getting in somewhere like Portugal, in southern Europe, for example. There's a convergence of experience there that's starting to take place. But more fundamentally, I think it's a convergence of experience of the climate crisis itself. That once you start to live in a world in which floods happen more regularly in Britain, then that is putting you into a similar position as people who are seeing floods happen more regularly anywhere else in the world. You're all starting to become part of a big global process. You're all being thrown into different versions of this. Now, the politics of that can spin out in all sorts of different ways. Like, I do think the radical right in Europe are ahead of the left on this one. If you see what's happened with the farmers' protest movement over the last sort of 12 months or so, farming in Europe is in crisis of climate change. The protest movement emerges across lots of European countries with the demands steered by the radical right to say, get rid of environmental protections because they cost us money and it's really expensive to go grow crops. So in other words, the climate crisis is getting rid of the things that are being put in place to try and deal with the climate crisis. Completely perverse, but that's a version of the politics you can get out of this. But the potential for convergence is really there. So if we're thinking about what that convergence might look like in a practical sense of what we're doing in this country, I thought there was an absolutely brilliant example in the French elections where almost out of nowhere, given the threat of the far right, the National Rally, Le Pen's National Rally, forcing the left in all its many varied different forms to work together and put together an absolutely fantastic radical programme to address the crisis in France that started with the cost of living crisis, named the cost of living crisis as part of the ecological crisis, includes a demand for wealth taxes, for public ownership, for collective ownership, to support small farmers against the big agribusinesses, for ecological planning is the phrase they use when they're thinking about how to distribute water and natural resources properly. It is an absolutely fantastic document they put together under pressure, under the direct threat of the radical right, the far right, coming to power in France, because that was the threat was there. And the result that we eventually saw is that the left won that election and the far right were not back into third place. They're still a threat. They're still there. They're still rising all over the place. But if you want a brilliant example of how you can take a desperate situation and turn it into something that works as a model program for what the rest of the left across the developed world can be looking at, then I do think the French left are something to look at right now.
I share that sentiment very strongly, but I'll add some other inspiring movements. So again, I'm going to start from the U.S., but kind of go global with it. Something that's recently inspired me just in the past week is that 7 of the largest labor unions in the U.S., representing about half of all unionized workers in the U.S., came out and finally called for an end to all military support for Israel. Not to downplay the urgent importance of a ceasefire and of that demand, but in the U.S. landscape at least, a more radical demand is calling for a permanent end. to military aid for an apartheid state. So that was very wonderful to see, especially from a labor perspective, given the not always great history of labor internationalism in the U.S., to see labor unions coming together, to see a really important union in that struggle, the United Auto Workers, who have a lot of Arab American members and have also been doing amazing militant strikes at EV and battery plants, right? So I think that there are a lot of connections between the internationalism that we're seeing around Palestine solidarity and the internationalism that we need to see in response to the climate crisis, and what kind of a popular mass movement to address both of those things might look like. And so for me, like, seeing labor unions at the forefront of internationalism, I think there's no more inspiring thing in this moment for me.
At the last COP, the President Petro of Colombia, he made a speech, and he said, "In the faces of the Palestinians, we in the Global South see our past, our present, and our future." And I think when you look at that speech and you look at the understanding increasingly of people to locate the struggle of Palestine, not simply as Palestine, but as a symptom of a much bigger story of colonialism, of settler colonialism, of duplicity of the global north to the south, of the power imbalances, of the idea of whose lives are worth saving and who isn't. It's been immense. So I think there's an incredible movement, and I do say, I think at this moment, the Palestinian people themselves are inspiring. I think that idea of, like, they are teaching the world, rest of the world, what humanity and solidarity looks like. Absolutely. And that has been an actual conscious part of that struggle for decades, to understand and connect. So when riot police were marching against attacking Black Lives Matter protesters, it was Palestinians that were sending over messages about how to be able to respond to tear gas, because that's the lived daily reality of making links with communities in the favelas in terms of repressive policing. The idea that we, in our struggle, are no longer possible to win in an individual fight. This is a movement of movements fight. And that brings it back to this climate moment, because I agree with you, James, that there is an immense moment at the moment. And the IPCC, the world's climate scientists, when they produced their last report, they said, the last sentence they said, "Change is now inevitable. The only question is what kind of change." And we would obviously add a line underneath about who pays the price. So at the moment, of course, the majority of climate policy is determined that the global south will pay the heaviest price and the poorest people in the global north will pay the price. And we have to tell a truth also, that actually a lot of what we think is radical in the global north is not radical. Net zero is not radical. 2050 is not radical. The idea that we have got this ability to be able to move from X to 100 millions of electric vehicles is not radical. Actually, what is radical now is talking about the idea of energy and food being a collective and a common good, of universal public services, of social protection, living wages, of housing, health and education, of the right for everybody to be able to live with dignity, of a new internationalism, of cross-class rebuilding, class solidarity, understanding how the inequalities of race and gender and other inequalities are baked into this system. There is immense possibility in that, and that's the movement of movements that is coming together. And I don't want to quote one of our enemies, but Milton Friedman, did say, and I send this quote to everybody who's like feeling doom-laden at every time. He said, it's not time to be doomed. And he said, only a crisis, real or perceived, produces change. Our goal is to keep our ideas and policies alive until the politically impossible becomes the politically inevitable. This is going to be a fight in the next 10 years about the change this world will see. And either, like in France, we're going to have an agenda that speaks to people's reality here and recognizes the reality globally, or it's going to be walls and fences, and it's going to be the far right, and they're going to be saying, there's nothing we can do, we have to sacrifice the majority of the world for us to be able to survive. And unfortunately, that is no longer just the far right. That is mainstream economic policy. It's mainstream climate policy of the UK government, of the European Union. Anybody who thinks we have got a carbon budget that allows us to go to 2050, you're talking about a 3-degree warming of the planet and a death sentence for billions of people. That wasn't a high, sorry. That was a bit doom.
I hope to see every single one of you there when we're building the new internationalism. So we've got 900 people at least in this room willing to. Please can everyone join me in giving a round of applause to our incredible first panel. So as promised, you will now have a short interval where you can grace the bar with your presence, you can order some merch, you can have a look at the books at the back of the room. Please be back in your seats by 8:45 when we will be commencing with the Verso Dig podcast crossover with Professor Laleh Khalili and Jeremy Corbyn MP. So 8:45. See you then.